So at the beginning of the year, Republicans shut down the government, and they became more unpopular than the party had been at any time in its history. Obamacare rolled out. It had a very rough implementation, but it ultimately came to the other side to sign up more than 8 million people. And you'd think, I think, from afar, with those two things happening, that would put, by the end, Democrats in a pretty good position. But certainly conventional wisdom in Washington is that you're going into the election in rough shape. So why in a year where there was a reasonably large policy success do things seem rough going into the midterms?
Well, the fact is the Republicans went way down in the polls with the shutdown of government. They're opposed to governance. They're anti-governance, they're anti-science, they're anti-Obama, they're a triple threat. So they have a trifecta going. And they act upon their beliefs. They don't believe in any of those things. And so everything is to obstruct the president. Anything that is evidence-based is unimportant to them. And again, to shut down government, anti-governance, was a victory. They saw that as a plus. They didn't see that as a shortcoming. They celebrated that. So the public made its reaction to it. But one evidence of governance would be how we rolled out the Affordable Care Act. It is intact. It's beautiful. As with everything, it's a work in progress. We need to improve it. But the website didn't work, and now it's well. Mm-hmm. And we go forward. But again, it was a setback. So we're at a place now where I think in another month or so, the public will really look up and say, what's the difference between these two parties? And when they do that, the main blueprint for each party is the budget, and that's where we'll have the debate.
I saw a number this week that anti-Obamacare ads, spending on anti-Obamacare ads, is outrunning spending on pro-Obamacare ads by 15 times.
Yeah.
Are Democrats going to make up that gap? Are they going to run on Obamacare this year?
Well, first of all, it is called the Affordable Care Act, and that word affordable is the word that we want the public to understand. Mm-hmm. The Affordable Care Act. For like $425 million were spent on ads against the Affordable Care Act. $27 million were spent on ads supporting the Affordable Care Act. That's just ridiculous. You know, it's more than, it's really an incredible difference. But we're not, as I said, we're not running on or from the Affordable Care Act. We're very proud of it. It's about wellness, it's about prevention, it's about technology, innovation, taking us forward. It's about value, not volume of procedures. And people really don't know that. And I think part of that accrues to us for not having an initiative that inoculated the public against some of these false attacks that the Republicans were making on it. So I think it turns out to be a wash. I think that's one of the reasons the Republicans have talked about Benghazi again. They're going to come back to Benghazi because the Affordable Care Act has lost some of its weight in terms of being a political issue for them.
But the way you put that was interesting. So you said Democrats are not going to run on or away from it. So it's not going to be, it's not something you feel is a political liability, but nor is it going to be core to the Democratic sort of affirmative messaging. You don't think that the signups are necessarily a huge electoral plus?
I think they are a plus, and members will make a judgment about their own districts about it being a plus. I think the Democrats will run on saying that the Affordable Care Act is really important for America's families, and that we stand ready to improve it as we see how it is implemented. I think that's a really important message, not to let it be repeal or retain, but to have the Affordable Care Act and improve upon it. I have some of my own suggestions that I couldn't get through on the first round, so I like that message.
How would you like to see it improved?
Well, of course, I wanted a single payer and I wanted a public option, but that not being in the mix, you have to prioritize what it is you want to get over the finish line. And now let's refine and improve, and some of that relates to how it is implemented. So you see how it is implemented.
The U.S. Congress doesn't seem to be getting a tremendous amount done but it also seems to be engaging in less somewhat disastrous high-stakes brinksmanship. There is not talk of shutdowns anymore. The debt ceiling gets raised without too much debate or discussion. Are things running, at least at the basic level of keeping the government's lights on, more smoothly in Congress now?
Oh, I don't think so. First of all, it's important to note that when we lifted the debt ceiling, not 199 Republicans voted to default on the full faith and credit of the United States of America. That's who we're serving with. 199 people who would default. When they shut down government and then opened it again, over 60% of the Republicans voted to keep it shut down. So, there is a conversation with the American people that has to be had, and it doesn't say nothing means we're getting along better. It means opportunity cost, opportunities lost. We should be passing an immigration bill. The Senate has done so in a bipartisan way. The public supports it. We should be raising the minimum wage. There's so many things that we should be doing that we're not doing, and that should not be considered a plus.
In the 2012 election, House Democrats won, and you'll know this number better than I do, about 1.5 million more votes in the popular vote than Republicans did, and it wasn't enough to capture the chamber. Have you guys done the math on what the margin would have to be to capture the chamber?
Well, it's a completely different race because that was a presidential, and so the numbers, we had 1.5 million more votes, but that did not add up to a majority because they were not in all the right places, because it's like saying the World Series, they got more runs than you did. Well, you didn't get them in the games, the different games. What we do know is that we have to increase the turnout in the off year, which is traditionally goes down considerably from the presidential. But again, a campaign is not just about winning or losing the election. That's certainly an important part of it. It's about winning or losing on the ideas. President Lincoln said that public sentiment is everything. And so what we want to do is have public sentiment express itself, because we know the polls tell us where they are on raising the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, the education of our children, all of those issues. But it does not necessarily transfer into votes unless they know the difference between the two parties on those subjects. And so from all of our M's, from our messaging, from our mobilization at the grassroots level, which is fueled by messaging, and the money to make it all happen, on all of those scores, we are way ahead of where we thought we would be at this time. The most important part of it all are the candidates, and the candidates are superb. They're excellent.
You mentioned a moment ago the money in the race. And there's a fascinating tension here, I think, for Democrats like you. You've been pushing very hard on campaign finance reform. Democrats have said, or House Democrats have said, that there should be revisiting even how the Constitution deals with money in politics.
Right.
On the other hand, you need a lot of money and need to do a lot of fundraising to remain competitive. You can't have, the Republicans have super PACs and you have none, and on. How do you navigate that tension? How can you sort of simultaneously be for aggressive campaign finance reform but participating in a system that is so suffused with cash?
Well, the equities that you have to weigh are, first and foremost, recognizing that our founders sacrificed everything: their lives, their liberty, their sacred honor for a democracy, a government of the many, not a government of the money. And that's what this could become. Now, that's one equity. The court has wrongly, in my view, decided that they could take off all these limits and have undisclosed, secret, special interest money flow into elections. We have to fight that. The only way we can fight it and win it in order to change the law and even maybe have a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United is to raise money to do it. Question is, what money is that? The money I raise, I'm probably right up there with the biggest fundraisers in the country. I know about raising money. It's a very idealistic group of people from around the country who really do want to see the role of money reduced in politics, and it is a motivator for them to participate. They're there about the air we breathe, the water we drink, the safety of our food. They're there for the people's interest, not the special interest.
But surely some of them want something. right?
Not
I mean,
really.
some of the
Yeah,
industries and some of the lobbyists, I mean, that donate to Democrats want things.
Well, I think maybe some of those people give to both sides, but that's not where I spend my time. I was talking about my time, and probably, I don't know, not 10% of what we raise comes from any Washington lobbyist community. And I say that because that includes a lot of our friends and who are here about the environment, who are here about workers' rights, labor, environmental, and all the rest. They're included in that number, but many people who share their views support us. But it isn't, but this is a small percentage of what we raise, and I don't disassociate myself from it. I just say, you would be surprised, obviously, to know that our small donor base is huge, idealistic, pragmatic, too, about winning, and generous in small donations, and that's the biggest part of our fundraising.
There's definitely more money in politics than there was in previous decades, but compared to when you came to Congress, do you think money is more capable of buying votes in Congress?
Oh, I don't think it's a question of buying votes. I think it's a question of electing people who share your view or not. And if one of the reasons that it's hard to get some things passed here is because there are people who share the view of their donors who have a special interest view of the world and a view of governance. In other words, what is the role of government? Is it to protect our air, our water, our food safety, and all those things? They don't believe that. I've always thought that whatever the role of money is, and I don't subscribe to what the Supreme Court says, it's only if it produces corruption does it matter. That's some of what they've said. I'm not saying that people who accept money, they may share their views and that's a legitimate place for them to be. I don't think it's right for our country, but that's the debate we have. But I do think it tremendously negatively impacts the confidence that the American people have in government. It produces a cynicism, a skepticism about what difference does it make whether I vote or not, because my voice is a very small one compared to this big money voice. I think that is more undermining to our democracy, more wrong, and made those Supreme Court decisions, McCutcheon and Citizens United, really, in my view, dangerous to our democracy.
You mentioned a moment ago the U.S.'s progression in its economy, and it actually made me think the big article people are talking about right now is Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece on reparations in the Atlantic. I was curious if you'd read it.
No, I haven't seen it yet.
One of the things the article goes through at some length is H.R. 40, which is Congressman Conyers' bill about doing a study on reparations. I'm curious if you've ever looked at it.
Well, I think that the value of Mr. Conyers' legislation is that I think that it's really important for us to have a renewed examination of conscience in terms of what happened in our country. Frankly, I mean, I tremble at the thought that slavery existed in this, the greatest country that ever existed. But what stuns me more than anything is that some of the horrors of discrimination that existed in my lifetime, not yours, but my lifetime during the Civil Rights Movement and the rest of that, that people would unleash dogs and clubs and all the rest that would keep people from libraries or schools or whatever it is. We considered ourselves to be in a more enlightened time, I would have thought.
Well, that's why I was fascinated by this bit about sort of Congress's ability to at least begin asking questions around this, because I agree, what's incredible about it is a compression of the time period. It wasn't 300 years ago or 200 years ago or even 100 years ago we were setting dogs loose on the streets on African American children. And yet when you talk about things like even a bill to like study the question of whether or not there's recompense that's needed, it has never made it to the floor of the House, and it's I think considered basically like a ridiculous marginal idea in a lot of circles anyway.
Well, I think the purpose of, well, you'd have to speak to him, but Mr. Conyers' bill is one that wants to provoke the discussion. Right. And a good deal of discussion has to be had before you can bring something to the floor of that consequence. And so I look forward to reading that article to see how it frames it all now. But I always talk at this building that we work in, the Capitol here, when Lincoln was inaugurated the second time, it was the first time that African Americans, blacks, whatever they would call them, Negroes, I guess, were able to come to an inauguration as a class of people, as free people. And the weather was terrible during that time. It was raining and it was off and it was on and that. And so they didn't know whether it would be inside or outside, and it ended up outside with the sun coming out for a moment there. But in the days leading up to it, the streets were mud. Of course, they were largely mud anyway. They weren't paved, but with the rain, they were mud. So the white folk who came to the inauguration came in their foul weather gear. But the blacks came in their Sunday finest, first time that they would be at an inauguration as a free people. And that's really how they have presented themselves ever since, in their Sunday finery, whether it's their finery of their voices in terms of speaking out on issues and making our country a fairer place, more American, or the value of their leadership in this building. And I sometimes think when I walk through the halls how those people that day would be so proud of our Congressional Black Caucus, who, the conscience of the Congress, who serve and speak here when they were coming the first time to a presidential inaugural as free people.
On a somewhat related note, 50-some senators put out a letter this week saying that Dan Snyder should change the name of it. 2 letters. Saying he should change the name of Redskins. Yeah. I'm curious if you've given that any thought.
Oh, I've called for them changing the name. And in fact, I mentioned that there are laws in terms of copyright and the rest and trademark which govern that you cannot use terms that are deemed to be, shall we say, slurs in your title. So I think that's something that we should look at. You know. And I'm glad that the senators wrote that. It was actually 49 wrote one letter and one wrote another letter, and some others support it but haven't written the letter yet, whatever it is. But it's a strong, voice. Yeah.
What can Congress do about the gender wage gap?
We're very excited because on the steps of the Capitol last July, on the 165th anniversary of the Declaration of Sentiments that said when all men and women are created equal, in Seneca Falls, New York, on that day on the steps, we announced our initiative, When Women Succeed, America Succeed. We had passed the first half of the year listening to women across the country about what were the priorities to unleash the power of women in the economy. This was just workplace. And that was about equal pay, raising the minimum wage, because 60% of minimum wage, more than 60% of minimum wage earners are women. It was about paid sick leave, which benefits men and women. It's about families. The greatest country that ever existed, I keep saying that, in the history of the world, you shouldn't have to put your child on a bus sick to go to school because you can't stay home for work. You'll be docked from pay or fired, and you have no financial ability to have child care, and you have no paid sick leave. So that shouldn't be the case, and that's very popular as well. And then children learning, parents earning, the missing link in the women getting the right to vote, women in the workplace, women in higher education, women making their own choices of being at home or at work, but needing, little children needing early childhood education, regardless of what their moms are doing. And this was really the thrust of it, a 3-legged stool of women's economic success. Our title, When Women Succeed, America Succeeds, is our title for our economic agenda for women and their families, but it's also a statement of fact. When women succeed, America does succeed.
What is your position right now on the ongoing scandal in the Veterans Health Administration? What do you think we know about it? What do you think should be done about it?
Well, I think any time that our men and women in uniform are not served in the manner in which they deserve, you could perhaps call it a scandal, because it's scandalous that they're not. Whether it is a scandal with intention and the rest of that, the evidence remains to be seen. But the fact is that they haven't been served worthy of their sacrifice or their role in our country. This issue, when I became leader, I made this, and now I'm going back even before Speaker, we didn't have the majority yet, but the Democrats planted a flag for the veterans. We said this is one of our priorities as we go forward, and we put forth initiatives working with the veteran service organizations to hear what their priorities were, which were many, and saying to them, now you prioritize and we'll time these, how we go forward. And some of the initiatives we put forward required more funding, and this is in the minority. The Republicans not only opposed what we were doing to increase the funding, et cetera, but the chairman of the committee, Chris Smith, the Republican chairman of the committee, agreed with us on some scores. And the Republicans not only deposed him as chair, they took him off the committee. So we believe, I mean, we're glad to see the cooperation and bipartisanship now, but Democrats have real standing on this issue. We promised the groups that when we would take the majority, we would go forward with some of the grander initiatives, which were advanced appropriations, a veterans budget. We did the GI Bill, the biggest one since the first GI Bill. So when we took the majority, we did what we said we would do. We also, at that time, passed a mental health parity legislation, and then in the Affordable Care Act, carried forth that mental health parity, which has a big impact on our returning vets. But I think what is necessary now, instead of spending time calling it a scandal or assigning blame, which you have to assign responsibility, is that I really do think that we have to take a look at the capacity of the Veterans Administration, that the committees of jurisdiction, which I think there would be strong bipartisan cooperation to do in the House and in the Senate, to say, this is what the need is, how do we fill it? Rather than this is the capacity we have, how do we incrementally get it to meet those needs? Because incrementalism is not my thing.
Right.
It's not my thing.
When you guys did the change on Agent Orange, what you did was you made it essentially an automatic eligibility if you'd been exposed. And a lot of the VA backlog is this sort of haggling over whether or not somebody got an injury in war or not. You said you're not for incrementalism. There are a lot of people who think that it should just be more or less you should accept the injury and then do back audits or other things. Yeah.
In fact, Representative John Hall, when he was here, that was a bill that he had put forth. You're there. This is your condition. Nothing more to discuss. So what is the point of having to document and prove and all the rest of that? First of all, administratively, it's a nightmare. Right. Secondly, it costs money. And what's the point? What's the point? I've had stories from young people telling me if they weren't for their wife or their mother or their father, somebody else to manage the documentation and the scheduling of appointments and the this and the proof of this or that, they would not be able to not to have achieved the successes that they have achieved. That shouldn't have to be part of it. I mean, we're asking these young people to not only go and die for our country, which I think almost anybody would say, I would die for my country, but we're asking them to kill for our country. That's pretty traumatic when you have to go and do it. And I think there's enough experience in our country from previous war, from veterans of other wars, especially the Vietnam War of more recent memory, that it's really hard to revisit. It's really hard to revisit that, especially in the very near term. As we observe Memorial Day, the end of May, the debt that we owe our men and women in uniform, the recognition that we have to have for their family members who are their unpaid, in most cases unpaid, caregivers. Stories that people came up and told me. They said, I had a job, I was on my own career path, my daughter was injured in Afghanistan, now I'm her caregiver, I tried to balance work and home, but I lost my job and now I've lost my unemployment insurance just because I was trying to take care of my daughter. And there isn't enough buy-in from the rest of our society and our economy to say, if you have a job and you have a war-wounded child, that you might need more time at home. So when Memorial Day was here, originally it started because the widows or women, some widows, some not, decorated the graves of soldiers north and south. Whether they were Union or whether they were Confederate, it didn't matter. Everybody's grave would be decorated because they were had suffered in the war. Of course, we're at a different place now. We're not fighting each other, but we really have to come together to recognize that when we make a decision to go to war, we better be on the level about what it's about, what its purpose is, what its prospects are, what its costs are, not only in dollars, but in our precious treasure of people and what it means to those families, not just for life, but if they die, for the rest of time, for their families. And I think we have to think in a bigger way rather than incrementally.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.